The year 1861 was not a year of grand European repose. It was merely a pause between catastrophes. In the gilded salons and smoke-filled cabinet rooms of Paris, London, and Berlin, the rising violence across the Atlantic was treated less as a tragic war of principle and more as a spectacular, if inconvenient, geopolitical opportunity. The grand experiment of American democracy, a system inherently distasteful to the Bourbon, Hohenzollern, and Habsburg heirs, was at last fulfilling its monarchical prophecy, tearing itself apart in a welter of fratricidal carnage. No one observed this rupture with more ravenous interest than Emperor Napoleon III of France. He was a man perpetually burdened by a glorious surname, forever living in the shadow of his colossal uncle. Louis Napoleon was desperate for a victory that would permanently etch his own name onto the scroll of French imperial history. Europe was tricky, the continental balance of power, enforced by the chilling realpolitik of British and Russian diplomacy, left little room for territorial expansion. But across the ocean, the American colossus was momentarily distracted. Its great self-imposed guard dog, the Monroe Doctrine, lying exhausted and ignored in the opulent but stifling air of the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by maps of the Americas. Stretched across polished mahogany tables, the emperor outlined his scheme. The Americans believe their doctrine is absolute, Napoleon mused, gesturing toward the vast, empty territory of Mexico. He addressed his foreign minister, Edouard Drouin de Lhuys, a man whose weary eyes suggested he had witnessed too many imperial follies already. They believe their geographical distance is their permanent shield. We shall test this premise, Edouard. We shall prove that without naval strength committed to the task, the doctrine is merely ink on old parchment. The pretext was debt. British, Spanish, and French loans demanded repayment from the perpetually unstable government of Benito Juárez in Mexico City. But the true goal for Napoleon was far grander: the creation of a vast Catholic European-friendly Mexican empire, a permanent French foothold in the Western Hemisphere, positioned to dominate Central American trade and act as a reliable source of raw materials. To accomplish this, he needed the Confederacy. To survive a divided America ensured the permanence of his puppet regime. If the Southern planter aristocracy succeeds in establishing itself as an independent republic, the emperor explained, tracing a finger along the Rio Grande, the United States will be fractured politically and militarily for a generation. The Union cannot move against us in Mexico if their border is held by their enemy. It is a perfect convergence of fortune. Edouard, the North fights the South. We reclaim our influence. The Mexican intervention began with chilling swiftness in late 1861, quickly escalating from a joint debt collection venture, with Spain and Britain initially involved, into a full-scale imperial occupation. By the spring of 1862, French forces were pushing into the heart of Mexico, meeting fierce, though ultimately doomed resistance. Napoleon, intoxicated by the early successes, soon installed the Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. The Union's reaction was exactly as predicted: utter, impotent fury. Secretary of State William Seward could only send blistering diplomatic notes, which the French treated with polite contempt. America was too busy strangling itself to enforce its own rules. But even as Napoleon savored the initial triumph, a critical flaw gnawed at the foundation of his Mexican empire. The cost, both in troops and gold, escalating dramatically. Sustained intervention in Mexico required not merely recognition of the Confederacy, but active military protection, a monumental undertaking that required the two things France lacked: uncontested naval superiority and limitless financial liquidity. For that, Napoleon needed his old ally, or perhaps his greatest rival, Great Britain. Chapter 2. The View from Whitehall. Across the Channel, the fog of London seemed to wrap Whitehall and Parliament in a perpetual cold. Pragmatism. The sentiment in Paris was one of grand ambition. In London, it was one of grim, detailed accounting. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, a statesman of 80 whose cunning was undiminished by age, viewed Napoleon III with profound distrust. Palmerston and his Foreign Secretary, Lord John Russell, were tempted by the thought of a permanently weakened United States, which had long been a commercial irritant and a repository for dangerous democratic ideals. The Confederacy, with its aristocratic leanings and its vast supply of cotton, seemed a natural ally for the landed gentry of Britain. However, British position was governed not by sympathy, but by cold calculation of risk versus reward. In the cabinet room, a meeting, late in 1862, laid bare the fundamental constraints facing the empire. The issue at hand was a French proposal, delivered via discreet channels for joint recognition of the Confederate States of America, coupled with a promise of French military aid to protect British shipping lanes. The Emperor offers us the glory of crippling the upstart republic, Palmerston summarized, his tone dry, adjusting his coat against the London chill that seemed to penetrate even the thick walls of the Admiralty. In exchange, we are expected to commit the Royal Navy to permanent escort duty across the Atlantic and underwrite Napoleon's entire Mexican folly. Lord Russell, meticulous and often gloomy, spread a series of reports detailing transatlantic trade flows. The financial reality has not changed, Prime Minister. Our textile mills were indeed inconvenienced by the cotton shortage, but India and Egypt have compensated rapidly. More relevant is the matter of grain. Russell tapped a specific section of the report. 40% of our annual wheat consumption now originates from the Union ports, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Should we recognize the Confederacy? The Union will immediately retaliate by declaring an embargo on grain. Our stockpiles are adequate for perhaps 6 months, perhaps less if the coming winter proves harsh. Are we prepared to face massive internal unrest, perhaps, famine for the sake of King Cotton, and Louis Napoleon's adventure? The room fell silent. Famine and mass civil unrest. These were not abstract threats in 19th century Britain. They were the terrifying reality that underpinned all domestic policy. The financial institutions are another matter, chipped in the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They are heavily invested in Northern Railway bonds and Union industries. Intervention means instant ruin for these investments. The economic case for non-intervention remains overwhelmingly strong, despite the rhetoric of the Manchester cotton barons. Yet the economy was not the only pillar of British policy. The second, and arguably more pressing concern lay not on the sea, but on the continent itself. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Bismarck. While Napoleon III obsessed over the exotic landscapes of Mexico and Palmerston debated the price of wheat, a seismic shift was occurring quietly in the minor German state of Prussia. Since 1862, Otto von Bismarck, a man of ferocious intellect and singular ruthless dedication, had been appointed minister-president. Bismarck's explicit goal was the unification of Germany under Prussian dominance, a feat that could only be achieved through iron and blood, and specifically through war with Austria and inevitably France. To the British, the burgeoning strength of Prussia represented a far more credible and immediate threat to the European balance of power than the distant American squabble. In a confidential memorandum circulated among the cabinet and intelligence officer, outer the dangers. If France commits significant military and naval assets to a prolonged transatlantic conflict, a war, with the Union, they will be fatally weakened against the inevitable confrontation with the Hohenzollerns. We cannot allow France to be crushed for that would hand the continent entirely to the nascent German Empire, creating a single military superpower on the Rhine. Palmerston understood the calculus perfectly. Britain's centuries-old foreign policy mandated preventing any single power from dominating Europe. If Britain helped Napoleon win a short war in America, it would distract France, deplete its reserves, and leave it vulnerable to Bismarck's perfectly prepared Prussian war machine. Non-intervention in America was paradoxically a form of continental security insurance for Britain. The situation was tested most severely, the Trent Affair, in November 1861, when the Union Navy illegally seized 2 Confederate diplomats from a neutral British mail steamer the public, the Admiralty and Parliament were instantly incensed. This was a violation of international law and an insult to the flag. The populace demands satisfaction. Lord Russell confessed to Palmerston moments after sending the ultimatum to Washington, demanding the diplomat's release and an apology. We have moved troops to Canada. The Royal Navy is mobilized. We are one misplaced word from war. Palmerston, ever the strategist, saw the danger. He knew the Union was bluffing, and he knew Lincoln was smart enough not to push a conflict with Britain while fighting the South. We will show strength. Russell Palmerston commanded. We will demand our satisfaction, but we will not move beyond that. Lincoln must concede, and will we do not commit to war over two insolent Confederate messengers when the true enemy, a war fought on our terms, for our gain, is in Europe? When Lincoln, recognizing the catastrophic danger, wisely backed down and released the prisoners, Britain had its victory without firing a shot. The public rage subsided, and the rationale for intervention evaporated. Chapter 4. The Fatal Alliance That Never Was. By late 1863, Napoleon III had exhausted his patience. His Mexican Emperor Maximilian was struggling to maintain control outside the major cities, and the French war chest was dwindling. The Confederacy, despite initial successes, was beginning to show signs of strategic collapse. The Emperor desperately needed the legitimizing weight of British recognition and the firepower of the Royal Navy. Adding insult to injury, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation at the start of the year. This diplomatic masterstroke framed the entire conflict in stark moral terms. The Confederacy was now fighting explicitly to preserve slavery. The proclamation has poisoned the well, Russell stated flatly in London. If we intervene now, we are seen not merely as supporting a trade partner, but as endorsing the continued bondage of 4 million souls. The working class, the abolitionists, and even large sections of the middle class will revolt against the government. The moral leverage is now entirely with the North. The final definitive rejection of Napoleon's renewed plea came, not in a formal treaty, but in a quiet diplomatic cable. Britain refused to recognize the Confederacy, citing diplomatic neutrality and internal economic risks. The decision was not based on American democracy or morality or the fate of the enslaved. It was based on geopolitical stability. Palmerston and Russell refused to expose the British Empire to domestic rebellion or Prussian opportunism for the sake of French imperial nostalgia. In Mexico, Napoleon III was left stranded. He had staked his reputation, his treasury, and his military credibility on a transatlantic gamble, believing the American conflict provided a distraction. Instead, he found himself isolated, deeply entangled in a Mexican quagmire, and financially exhausted. The American Civil War would play out on its own terms, decided by the Americans. But the consequences of the non-intervention, a byproduct of decisions made in London and filtered through the shadow of Berlin, would soon reverberate back across the Atlantic. For Napoleon III, the failure to secure British support for the Confederacy meant the slow, agonizing death of his Mexican empire. He would eventually have to recall his troops, abandoning Maximilian to the fury of the victorious Mexican Republicans. But a far greater threat was already massing in the east. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863, Bismarck, watching the exhausted state of France, realized his moment was approaching. The resources Napoleon had squandered in Mexico were resources unavailable for the defense of the Rhine. The British, relieved the American war had not escalated, returned their focus entirely to the rising geopolitical temperature of Central Europe. The calculation was complete. Europe's empires had chosen prudence over ambition, stability over glory. But Emperor Napoleon III, prudence had come too late, and the limits of his transatlantic reach would soon be measured against the unstoppable force of Prussian militarism. The American Civil War was over, but the great European conflict it had, temporarily deflected, was about to begin. The fate of the Second French Empire, sealed by the refusal of its powerful neighbor to commit to a distant cause, now rested precariously on the ambitions of one man, Otto von Bismarck.